Do you guys mind if we record this round or?
Yeah, it's fine.
Are you guys all good?
Yeah.
And is the panel okay?
Alright.
Thank you very much.
So is everyone ready?
Okay.
When Steph Curry joined Golden State Warriors, they were worth only $300 million with no bath rewards. Now, by the end of his career, not only did he become one of the best, he made sure to ingrain the Golden State Warriors roster as unforgettable and worth more than $9 billion with a bright path forward. We stand for leagues that support long-lasting legacies, that improve competitiveness and well-being of sport. Two paths to victory in my speech. Firstly, on why is it justified to reward players principally, and then secondly, on how do we increase enjoyment of sports overall for fans. But before that, a few points of setup in my speech. Firstly, what is this debate about? It's about the decision that players make about leaving a team. This happens in two particular scenarios. A player contract runs out and they're offered a contract by other teams. Or secondly, B, a player disappointed by the team's results and requests to leave the team. Comparatively then, on our side, players are more likely to stay with their team due to the financial incentives that we further explained in my speech. The debate then consistently centers then around whether the endorsement to stay is specifically good or bad. Second point of setup. Why is this beneficial for players to stay? Currently, there are players who would like to stay, but teams are unable to offer them large enough contracts, specifically in the status quo. On our side, leagues subsidize these bonuses that teams cannot afford. Note that for this debate to function, we believe that these bonuses have to be large enough for these players to matter, so they stay in these teams. Second, the third point of framing. Players will value loyalty, right? Also, most people who become athletes are fans of certain teams. They value loyalty as fans and continue to do so that as players. And fourthly then, fans love certain players. Usually it's the best players who score the most points and people attach themselves to them and love seeing them play. We believe that fundamentally, most of the fan bases build their own fandoms around the players and not the teams explicitly. That is why specifically we center my speech around players. Moving on to the first argument on my speech. Why is it principally justified to reward players for their sacrifice? How do players then sacrifice themselves by staying in the team? And we have three main reasons here. Firstly, none of those sports people's careers are relatively short, right? Choosing to spend 5 years of their own precious and counted time in one team is an immense sacrifice for any upcoming sports person in any different sport. Then secondly then, by training with the team, they're constantly at risk of an injury that could end their career. 5 years of risking it all and exhausting your Achilles heel for one team is a significant sacrifice that we believe exists on our side of the house. But then thirdly, there is an opportunity cost of doing sports. These players could have spent 5 years working on their other careers or creating a family, and they actively choose to give their time to endless, exhausting trainings. Therefore, what is this principle about? Know the immense mental and physical resources that these sports people exhausted for their team. These are the loyal and value-driven players who pay the bills of a league with their own literal sweat. We tell you then that since the league benefited and got richer off of these impressive sacrifice of players, they give them monetary support. But this is extremely simple. If somebody earns you more money, you pay them a fair share of that money. Loyal players are the hardest workers, carrying the sports industry on their backs and thus deserve recognition of it. Sure.
All of your analysis as to why you have a principal justification also applies to all professional players. Why is it that you specifically want to hear the accomplished players?
Because we believe there is a significant difference of spending 1 year at a certain team and then 5 years. Because when young players try to jump for different teams, they're not sacrificing anything for one specific league because they're not building a legacy on their side of the house. We believe that when you start building a legacy in a certain team, that's where we believe that you sacrifice your most precious prime time. That is why I believe you should be accountable. That should be accountable for it. Moving on to the third argument on the practicalities on how do we increase enjoyment of sports for the fans. There are two paths in this argument to show how fans can engage with their favorite games more. First, we will show that there is increased competitiveness within leagues, but then secondly, we'll prove why for the viewer consistency of their team's roster is a crucial part of the experience right now. But no judge, as in our frame, there is a decreased engagement with sports and society. This looks like, this year's NBA Finals being the least watched finals in history, and this being like even overcome by the Summer League games currently. We think that this is a direct consequence of the current structure of teams resulting in little competitiveness. This looks like domestic leagues dominate but one or two rich teams that buy up the most important and valuable players. This looks like constantly trading players across leagues as they sale and buy to the economic conditions. How does this change, specifically on our side of the house? We have three ways of analysis here. Firstly, we believe that players considering leaving for a higher contract reconsider their choices as they prioritize the prospect of an eventual bonus. But then secondly, players have less short-termist mindset. A one bad season on someone's third year in the team will not make them leave, because now they have to weigh their short-term disappointment against the long-term possibility of getting this bonus on our side. But then thirdly, then, small teams that currently can keep players because they don't have the large budgets are subsidized by the leagues that will hand out these bonuses. The exclusive ability to build on, then we have on our side, the exclusive ability to build a long-term strategy on our side. Look, the teams that perform the best are also the teams that have the most consistent rosters. This is because A, you are able to adjust the team strategy over a wide range of performances. And after 5 years, you know the players so well. Then secondly, this also means that team dynamics adjusting over time, right? Teams perform best when all the players are well working with other players and fulfill their roles in the team. This takes time, and as you have to form these relationships and trust, and we believe this is so crucially important when building an actual championship winning of a team, of a possibility of it. Then secondly, good players, we believe, are going to like to stay there, right? Look, we think that inherently a lot of the players care about their teams and represent their fan base. They don't want to go through the problems of joining a new environment, adjusting to new teammates, and adjusting to new strategy. However, under the status quo, they often still leave purely because of the economic motives that motivate them. This changes on our side, and you don't have to ultimately reset the opportunity of high salary, and you know that your commitment will actually grant it. All of this means that teams experience less changes in team lineups, and this forms a better strategy to keep those players. But then secondly, these small teams have hope to keep more of their product players as they gain better rosters. More fierce competition in these matches. This is the specific impact that we have of thrilling sports watch. Let's move on to the second layer of this analysis, right? Like an emotional toll of players leaving a team experiences. Two explanations here. After a 5 years old, and most players start to look around for a better pay, leagues imposing this board means they're unlikely to do so. We leave it on a position such as in defense or betrayal. So because of all of these reasons, I believe that we exclusively have the impact of keeping players and keeping that habit. So happy to be on a team proposition.
Can I be heard at this volume? Two arguments from opposition. Firstly, on why this is better for leagues. Secondly, on why this is better for players. Firstly, I want to talk about frame and few responsibilities side Firstly, let's talk about the principle. They say it's justified principally because big players have, or like players who have played in the league the longest have sacrificed the most things. I would make two responses. Firstly, things like time is often symmetric in most cases. Like they never prove why this only applies for accomplished players who have played for 5 years or longer. But secondly, I would even argue and go further that smaller players are the ones that are sacrificing more resources. These are players that have no time off to take time with their families. They are the people who have less money to invest time with their families and things like that. Therefore, their side disproportionately harms smaller players. We think this is a principal harm that they must contend with. Second argument about more attention for leagues. I'm going to argue in my speech that this is players moving around in different teams is actually a good thing. I'm going to flag it for you in my speech. Let's move on to the frame. First, most importantly, we presumably have massive counter-propaganda on opposition. We use the money to tackle whatever the biggest problem that league is facing is. So if you're a small league, you might want to distribute it among smaller teams. Maybe you want to spend it on for advertisements. If you're not a well-known league, you want to spend it on player development. Maybe it's funding grassroots sports. But the point is, the burden on top is not just to prove an impact, but to prove this is the best use of money. No, thank you. Beyond everything else we can do. Second point on frame. Who are the players that are likely care about this bonus? The best players in the top leagues like Steph Curry presumably aren't the delta. They're already rich to some extent. Who will care about this? Two types of players. Firstly, average or above average players in good leagues, or secondly, top players in small leagues are the type of people who are likely to care who have a significant delta in this debate. First argument then, on why this is good for the league. 3 reasons why this is true. A, trade itself is interesting, right? Trade transfers are often picked up on the news. Transfers of players get millions of views in minutes. Cristiano Ronaldo moving to Manchester United got millions of likes in minutes. The reason why this is true is it's new, it's unexpected, it's significant for many teams. But also, the power balance shifting within the leagues is often interesting. When players stay in the exact same team for every single year, the table stays the same. All the good teams win every time, all the small teams never get up. But when players move, there's often power differences in the league, which creates an incentive for people to actually watch the league, because you never know in the next season who is going to go up a position or who is going to win the league. Which means, because it is unexpected, but it also creates competition. But note here that rotation players are often the factor for power change. They cannot say it's the big players that need to move to create power balance, balance changes. Because sports is not just one person, it is 11 players or 20 players on a team who are changing the dynamics of the sport. Even rotation players are the ones that significantly change. The implication of this is that there's an increased viewership in the league, which means there's more investment, more revenue, more viewership for the league. The second reason why this is better for the league is on merchandise sales. When players move between clubs, there is a significant amount of goods being sold for leagues, and this is actually good. One of the biggest ways the league makes money in the status quo is through things like merchandise. Golf cannot come up here and say there's alternatives to this. I think things like changing jerseys every single year is not significant enough to something that we can propose on our side of the house. This is true for 2 reasons. Firstly, often the things that clubs can do when players stay in the same club is marginal at best. And you can create jerseys with different colors, but it's not significant enough for people to want to buy that jersey because it's often expensive to buy that jersey. But secondly, the people who you are targeting at is often the same. The significant delta we can create on our side of the house is that you shift the target to a different fan base, which means that there's a new target where you can sell jerseys to, which means there's a significant increase in revenue on our side of the house. The third reason why this is true is concentration of skill. Note here that this directly clashes with their second argument. Players can move to different leagues in different countries. This has 2 implications. Firstly, stronger leagues become more competitive. Look at the MLB in the status quo, whereas in recent years, Korean players, Japanese players, Taiwanese players have been moving to the bigger leagues, which makes competition more interesting. The MLB has seen increased viewership in recent years. But secondly, it's also worse for worse league to balance out, because in the status when one strong player stays in the worst leagues, it often makes it boring. The intuition pump here is the FIFA Club World Cup that was held last month was very boring because the good teams beat small teams 10-0. No one wants to watch that. But the mechanism for this is that it's often bad for the league when a concentration of views concentrate in one team. Because maybe you may get viewership for one team, but every single other game in that league, no one wants to watch because there's only one good player in that league. The impact of this is twofold. Firstly, on the league, there's more money, there's more attention, there's more investment into the league. This is especially good for smaller leagues. But secondly, this is also good for teams, because also it's good for smaller teams because merchandise sales and transfer fees are often what gives revenue for smaller teams. But in general, you can invest in things like development of youth clubs, or you can do things like invest in your infrastructure, which is often good for teams as a whole. Before I move on to my second argument, what is better for players, I'll take that.
Yes, do you support Saudi Arabia and China building football leagues with massive amounts of money and players moving there?
Yeah, if people want to move there, I think so we can make money for it. Like for players, I think this is perfectly fine. Second argument on why this is better for players. I'm going to explain this in 3 layers. Firstly, on why players won't leave on-site governments. There are 2 reasons why this is true. Firstly, on optimistic bias. Firstly, on intuition, sports players are often confident in the skills they have. They have made glorious achievements in the past. They have been the best players in their original regions. But also, people around them are the ones that are often most optimistic and most often motivate them to try to work harder and try to stay in that club and to get accomplished. This means that you feel that you are able to become accomplished in that same team by staying for another year, trying for another season. But the second reason is on sunk cost fallacy. For example, if you have already stayed 2 years in the same club, there's no reason for you to actually move in their side of the house, because if you stay for 3 more years, you might be able to get that accomplishment and get that influx of money they have on their side of the house. But also the reason is that you don't know other alternatives in other clubs, which creates a fear for you to not leave. Why does this change on our side of the house? Firstly, obviously optimism does exist on our side of the house symmetrically, but the optimism will be used to move to other clubs, because you're not searching for opportunities in the same club by staying there and thinking that you'll succeed in that original club, but now you think you can succeed in other clubs. Secondly, the sunk cost fallacy obviously doesn't exist on our side of the house because this policy doesn't exist. Why is this important? This is important on 2 levels. Firstly, players on bad contracts can often leave these clubs. There are many teams which have bad managers or bad coaches who often harass these players, or players often feel sick and tired working in these clubs. But secondly, this is also important in terms of career development. Players often end their careers in these clubs feeling optimistic and feeling that they can improve their careers in the club. The alternative we propose on our side of the house is that players can search for other opportunities in other clubs. Players often in their original clubs may not have a position to play, or because that position is too competitive in the club, or they just might not fit in the system of that team. Players can often find different clubs who want these players, or who have the same system as those players, or the style that they play is often better in other clubs. Players can change for opportunities, and this is especially significant for sports players whose careers are very short. 1 year, 2 year difference is very significant for these players when they can advance their careers and not end their careers by getting injured or getting fired from their clubs. For all those reasons, we're very proud to stand in opposition.
For the speech, I would like to invite the commission speakers.
No matter what merits or benefits they prove to small teams, Saudi Arabia and Israel will always have bigger funds. Sports washing will still be enabled at the point at which we don't put value on loyalty, at the point at which we don't put value on sacrifice and dedication. That is when you have the largest countries like Saudi Arabia buying up players from these leagues because these values are diminished, and therefore it's very easy to buy up and build a super league to wash out what their country is generally doing in the global arena. I will put this to you in my speech, very proud to stand propositions. In my speech today, I'll address 3 questions. Firstly, on the principle, secondly, on fan enjoyment, lastly, on players, and then I'll do a weighing of overall in the debate, right? Firstly, on the principle, right? Note that we never based our principle only on the accomplished players, right? It was never in our speech. We talked about that every single player who sacrifices their health, who sacrifices their dedication, who sacrifices their career to one team, they're already in that self justified to get compensation. We told you that any single player who has been playing for a team for more than 5 years already means that they are literally refusing alternative careers that may bring them more profit, right? This also means that these people are dedicated to one's team interest over their own well-being. But lastly, it's just the physical dedication that you put in to advance the team and advance your strategy. All of these things apply to accomplished and to non-accomplished players equally. We never talk about accomplished players exclusively, and they rebutted this entire argument on a misconception. But secondly, like we tell you, why does this matter, right? Why does this principle is so crucial in this debate? Note how we apply this principle in other spheres of life, right? We literally reward, office workers that are loyal to that same office by giving them higher bonuses. Loyal customers also get benefits in markets, in supermarkets, right? Because we value generally the loyalty of people, right? We recognize that it's an active decision of compromise over stuff. But then moving on to the final engagement, right? What do we tell you, right? Firstly, we tell you that under the status quo, there is decreasing engagement, right? This is very clear if you look at the stats of how many people watch sports in the first place. It's the fact that people literally, haven't watched the NBA finals as they used to do that in the past, right? We think that this is literally because there's little competition and a lot of inconsistency. It's become hard to track, what sort of players are playing in what games. Every year you have a new, team consisting of different players, right? Because there's so many sellings and resellings happening under the status quo, right? What did they tell you? They just say that trade is interesting. We tell you, first of all, trade still happens. This debate, as we frame it, is not about trade, right? This debate is about the situations where a player's contract ends and they're considering whether they can get a good contract with additional bonuses or if they should move to a better team, right? We think that trade is inclusive on either side of the house, and we frame this already, right? But secondly, we tell you that it's just, untrue that trade is interesting for the average, player, right? Why do we tell you this? Because there is emotional connection that you build as a viewer to the team, right? Because if you've spent, years watching that same team, you've spectated the same players running in the field, you know what to expect from them, and it is so interesting to see, the player go and kick the ball. You are emotionally connected to these players, right? So when they leave, it is not interesting for you to see the trade, right? Because it is literally you are literally losing something that was so crucial for you in that team, right? But then furthermore, they talk about power imbalance, right? We think this is much worse on their side than their own mechanism. Why? Because they tell you, first of all, that they tell you essentially that best teams will get these players at the point at which you no longer have these bonuses, and that the fact of how much wealth you have will determine how many players are able to buy up. Essentially, they are pretending the status quo, right? Because their alternative on small teams doesn't really essentially do that much through that mechanization. Why? First of all, because if we prove to you that this is essentially the fact that there's a new player coming doesn't thrill the fans, then it already proves that the revenues they talk about essentially don't exist, right? And we've proven to you this by the emotional connection. Before I go on, I can take it away.
Everyone knows about the Luka Doncic's trade. How can you say trade doesn't create interest, even for the average fan?
Look, trade happens on both sides of the house, right? We bring to you. This is literally about when players themselves feel that the contract has ended and they see that the funds will be insufficient, therefore they ask for another team, or they ask the team to sell them because they feel that the performance is lacking in their team, right? Trade literally happens on both sides of the house, right? Okay, well, moving on, right? We tell you essentially that the way that we improve competitiveness is in 2 ways. Firstly, it's about the team strategy possibility, right? At the point at which to build a team strategy, it is a very long-term process, right? Because you have to have the dynamics within the team settled. You have to understand who is the locker guy, who is the aggressive guy. All of these things change from team to team, right? But secondly, it's about the fact that the coach is able to see and know what to expect from every single player, and that only happens over time. That's when we're able to build a long-term, idea of how to adjust these players, when to let them play, how quickly they get exhausted. All of these things can only happen on the long term. This means that the coaches get more control of their teams and therefore are able to maximize the performance, have like caps set for how much they can spend, and then the only reason on our side of the house for players to stay in like the smaller teams is because you have bonuses, right? It's because you know that if you stay another year or another 2 years, that's when you will be appreciated for all the dedication that you have put in, right? So we think that ultimately we are able to prove to you that the competitiveness and performance of the team increases. Why is this important? Because for the fans who are sitting behind their screens, who are spending their evenings watching these games, that is what represents them. That is what represents their interest. To see your team win, that for you is huge catharsis, right? We think that this ultimately is very important. It was weighed against their idea of excitement of something new, right? When a new player comes in, and that's when it's fun to you. We think it's about the psychological factor within this weighing, right? We think it is far more likely that you feel more excited when you see a player that you've spectated for 5 years do something that you're proud of, than it is to see a new player, a new face that you're seeing for the first time come in, which you don't really know, you don't know what to expect from them. We think that the emotional connection here outweighs, any merits that fans can achieve. Lastly, we think it is really crucial to know that they consistently why that they're okay with Saudi Arabia buying up players. Why is this so important in this debate? Because note how the current sports status quo looks like. It looks like countries that generally do a lot of human rights abuses, like Saudi Arabia and Israel or Iran. They are literally spending a lot of money and a lot of investment into their sport coaches. Because through this, they are able to sport wash and create a good international image by having very competitive, teams. So this looks like literally Saudi Arabia buying up all the best players globally, forming the best teams, but literally treating them so badly because the idea of this whole thing is, and the interest of it is to make, a good promo in like the international scene. They enable this on their side of the house at the point at which they are fine with, the incentives of loyalty diminishing. Last, on players, right? They tell you this claim that players will be too scared to leave bad teams because even if they get abused, right? We have 3 responses to this. First of all, we think this is unlikely to happen at the point at which it is a team that you are playing for in a long time because that team values you, right? That you have been working for that team for a long time, so that team sees more significance in your contribution. We think it is less likely to happen, like abuses are less likely to happen on our side in the first place. But secondly, we give you numerous reasons why it's likely that these things improve over time. That's our mechanisms of, strategy and all these things that they never about, right? But thirdly, we think it's just regardless of these the situation, it is principally just to assure for all players, regardless of how they are treated in the team, that they get compensation. Even if you're treated badly, you still get compensation and are rewarded for your loyalty here at the stand proposition.
Yeah, thanks, Steve, for the speech. I invite the second publisher.
I want to dispel with 2 things extraneously before we get into the more important comedy stuff.
Yes, sorry.
Yeah, well,
Yes, sir.
good.
Second.
Good. I want to once again dispel with 2 things extraneously then. The first thing is going to be on the principle, the second thing is going to be on sports washing. These won't be important in making a decision for the debate. I'll talk about the rest later. First thing on the principle. There are 2 reasons why this is not that important in this debate. 1, To the extent of their analysis, all they prove is justification, not necessity. We agree to some extent that this policy is just. This is not something where everyone who convinces you on this principle is okay, you can see. But secondly, we already sufficiently do most of the we must reciprocate and pay these players back anyway. Teams pay these players substantially, bonuses still exist based off of performance, etc., etc., etc. These protections and payments already exist. We fulfill the principal need to pay these players well, and teams have the incentive to do so. The second thing I want to dispel with then on sports washing. On an intuition pump level, I want you to look at, for example, the Saudi League, where players like Ronaldo exist. These players are players who have played for 5 years for one team and have still come here. On an intuition pump level, this analysis is wrong. This already happens and happens anyway. But there's two other responses I want to give. One, there's a bunch of reasons as to why the average players are unlikely to go to the Saudi League. Obviously, for example, that it's less competitive and fun, or the change in scenery and the change in place you are is more scary to do, etc., etc., etc. But even if you don't take this line of analysis, we don't think sports washing has that big a harm in this debate anyway. Don't connect this harm anywhere. For example, UN suits against Saudi Arabia and their financial mismanagement and hypocrisy haven't gone away just because they've created a league, and Qatar will still fall out for humanitarian crises and bad abuses of their power during the World Cup, even though they did host the World Cup. Sports washing has historically just failed in being effective. We don't think it's the impact in this debate. Two clashes then. First, I'm going to talk about players, because 10 seconds of response from their second is not enough for them to win the clash on players. We would argue this alone is independently debate winning. Then secondly, on leagues. Firstly, on players, I first want to dispel their argument, or essentially one-line mechanism from their first speaker, to talk about the emotional toll of transfer that is on the players. We would like to do two things. One, obviously we flip this. There's obviously some amount of excitement that comes once a trade is confirmed. You have incentive to rationalize your way out of scary things once something has been confirmed. But we also weigh this off really easily, right? The emotional toll of transfer is probably much less important than institutionalized abuses of power or harmful practices in a team. We prove this argument from the second argument in our speech. The only response from their bench is to argue that abuses are less likely because loyalty happens in our world. Two reasons why this is an insufficient response. One, obviously the illustrative examples you posed as to the harms players face have nothing to do with whether we can solve this with loyalty, but are more institutionalized problems or problems that inherently exist because you stay in one team. But also secondly, oftentimes the disincentive to move out of a team creates active capacity for the team to abuse you, which is why loyalty can actually be on net harmful. This proves the players clash, and we would argue this is a big impact in this debate. Yeah, go ahead.
Look, the only reason why you care about this bonus in the first place is because you care about the team and you're considering whether your loyalty is worth the financial compromise. That means you're likely not being abused. Can you recognize this?
Yeah, from our first speaker, we did the weighing between financial incentive and the incentive to move elsewhere. We proved to you that oftentimes abuses are not severe enough or don't impact you enough, and there are other biases that manifest that prevent you from being able to move out. Okay, let's talk about the lead then. The first thing I want to do is to talk about how our second mechanism is independently debate winning on the league. Our second mechanism was on sales for the league. Crucially, we would argue that these merge sales are more impactful to the monetary benefit of the league than is the competitiveness of the league for a few reasons. One, core fans essentially will still watch the sport regardless of the competitiveness of the sport. For example, if you look at Formula 1, 3 teams have been dominant over the past few years. Red Bull was dominant for a total of 4 years, and people still watched the sport. Crucially, this means the core fans who matter most still stay. The delta then becomes on whether they spend money when they're watching the sport, which is crucially where, for example, merchandise sales manifest. But also secondly, because oftentimes the amount of money that a league has directly impacts its competitiveness. The reason why people don't watch lower division sports is because it's less entertaining. So the more money the league has on net, the more competitive the league will be. This is logically prior. Why then is money the most important thing under this clash? Firstly, obviously the majority of the impacts on entertainment largely will impact to profit for the league, but also we can impact everything else they would like to claim as a result of entertainment with league money. We can use money to, for example, fund smaller teams, but that would then allow for the competitiveness to be gained. We can use money to, for example, make broadcasts more entertaining, etc. So as long as we improve this one mechanism, we can take this entire clash. Let's be more charitable though and deal with the rest of the argumentation under this clash. Firstly, from our first speaker, we posed that trade itself is an entertainment. There are 2 levels of response we get. The first is a direct response. That is to argue that the average fan is not interested in trading. The problem with this analysis is twofold. One, we talked about the direct implications of the trade. even if it's not the trade itself that is interesting. For example, the fact that your own favorite team's members
You know why?
or the fact that your fan, or the fact that your team, for example, has a new great pitcher. Crucially, we argue that that is still an intuitive thing that a fan can internalize and understand and is entertaining. But also secondly, these have incentives to make it easy for you to understand. Things like TV broadcasts or explanations or 3D MLB app, for example, which allows for entertainment to be derived from the trade. The second indirect response we get is this idea that rich teams will buy small, strong players, which makes the league less competitive on net. First response, if this were to be true, this costs a lot of money on their side because they have to keep these strong players. Crucially, per our counter model, we can do things like redistribute money to smaller teams too. Note that this is not just a symmetricization effort, but actually a flip against that argument. We would argue that increased monetary distribution is the better way to create stronger, more competitive leagues than is keeping one strong player in a small team. This is because team sports are inherently team sports, which means the overall average level of the team is far more important than having one strong player. For example, look at the Angels in 2021. They had 2 good players, but the team sucked and they lost most of their games. Secondly, I would argue we actually win on small teams. This is because the main way small teams can make the majority of their profit is to do something called feeding and selling their players. Essentially, what we do is we buy young players, bad players, we train them, and then we sell them for a lot of money. This is only possible when loyalty systems don't exist. We would argue then that small teams can actually create more profit in our world where the incentive for loyalty doesn't exist. We can buy young players, we can train them, and we can sell them for a lot of money, which allows for the funding of small teams. Unengaged is the third mechanism on concentration of skills. I'm not going to bother repeating that for you. They obviously have to engage to it. Let's look at the other random bits of analysis we get from their bench to prove this league must cheating. The first thing we get is consistency is important to make the team better. But the problem is twofold. One, in our world, every team rotates their players, which means on net, the competitiveness is symmetric because no team is consistent to their roster, which means no team gains an advantage as a result of this. But also secondly, on margin, the implication of making a team better as a result of consistency is obviously smaller than the players that you actually have. Like for example is you have a designated blocker guy. Clearly that's not a big delta in this debate. The next claim is fans love one player and this leads to entertainment. Well, the problem is twofold. One, we are going to mechanize why it's fairly easy to find an alternative. One, you obviously love the sport, which means you will continue to watch it and therefore have incentive to create new attachments to the new player. Secondly, there's active incentive to expose yourself to new players and it's fairly easy to do, so the league makes it easy to do, so your team markets the best players, etc. Thirdly, you can obviously still follow your favorite player. They're not going to die. Like, I from Japan can follow Otani in whatever sport, whatever league he's playing. Like, the increase of internet allows for me to track my favorite player. The final mechanism we get from prop is this idea that tracking becomes harder. Obviously, the fans for whom tracking is hardest for are fans who are not core supporters. These are not the important fans in this debate. We argue they don't matter. For these reasons, propose. Damn it, it was proposed, wasn't it?
I'd like to speak for the speech. I would like to remind all the speakers to please be respectful in offering the audience. And I'd like to invite you first to go to the questions.
Yes, okay. Hi, team. Jonas, no preference on the pronoun. We'll start in just a second. Israeli basketball teams have recently invested insane amounts of money into their teams, signed some big name players like Lonnie Walker or Patrick Beverly. These names are what make people interested into these teams. They then sports wash. They think that what happens in Israel and what happens around the team is not so bad. You cannot just claim that this doesn't matter because it doesn't work, because the UN still does things. This is not what sports washing is. Sports washing is how you perceive, as an individual, when you watch an Israeli team play, how you perceive Israel as a country and what they are doing. It's about the common man and how they view the world. We think that this impact still stands at this point in the debate, and therefore it is enough for us to even win the debate, and they concede to even in their first speech. In my speech then, 4 strategical things in this debate of like clear up, then 3 clashes. Firstly, on the principle, why it matters and why it wins as the debate. Secondly, on the fans and on the league in general. And thirdly, on like the players, which matters very, very little in this debate. Firstly, first strategical mistake. They don't have the fiat to claim that they will redistribute money to all the teams and make the league competitive like this. Why? Because it breaks antitrust laws. Teams are separate entities, and you cannot, take money from them or give money to them in that sort of manner because of the antitrust laws that exist. Like teams sign contracts with leagues, this breaks contracts. This is something you cannot do, right? Second thing, they debate like there are only small teams and big teams. That is not the case. There are mid-sized teams that also matter in this debate, right? It is teams, and this is where the debate is actually happening about these like middle-sized teams. These middle-sized teams who would really want to keep some players, but just don't have as much money as the richest teams. The leagues then subsidize these teams and give them more money to give the players for them to stay. We think that this is the ultimate impact in this debate. The question is whether that is good or bad. They did not come the debate on this delta. We gave you this delta from the very start of our speech. Lastly then, this is very strange for the side of opposition in this debate, because they debate that there's like a very good impact in trades happening, but it seems like the status quo is that trades are forced to happen. That is literally not the status quo. Trades don't happen like all that often. Sure that some trades happen and some trades are interesting, but it's not something that is huge at the moment, and it's not going to be huge on their side of the house. This is about like players staying in teams, and this is what we really want. Okay, on the principle then. What do we bring you in the principle of this debate? You sacrifice something to stay on a team. They must even misunderstand my principle, right? You sacrifice something to stay on a team for a long time. What are things you sacrifice? Your sacrifice may be more money, maybe more winning opportunities, maybe even the weather, right? You may be sacrificing playing in an area where the weather is worse, right? You're sacrificing these things, and therefore you should be paid because you are making these sacrifices. They say they agree to this principle, they just don't understand the necessity. But the necessity is very clear. This is basically reparations for these players. These players sacrifice something and therefore have to get reparations because they sacrifice something. This is very intuitive, and this is the necessity that must happen, right? At their best, it is like these players who sacrifice a lot. It's like players like Dirk Nowitzki who sacrificed half of their salary to stay on the team and to make the team better. At their worst, it's locker room guys who barely touch the court and barely even play, but they stay on the team to help the team morally, and they still help the team. And therefore, even then, all of these people are making some sacrifices, and therefore they should get paid more, right? Lastly then on the principle, they also concede to sports washing. Why is this impact? I've already explained it, but why is this? Yes. They concede when they say that more people on their side of the house basically move to Saudi Arabia. They say that a lot of people move because there's a monetary incentive, and therefore they say that they support more people going to Saudi Arabia because of the monetary incentive. This is what they claim. They claim that trades happen, players move because of monetary incentives, so therefore when Saudi Arabia comes in with a lot of money, they buy up more players, right? There's sports washing in that. We tell you sports washing is horrible, because why? You are selling your morality, you're selling your moral accountability you place on countries like Qatar in order to watch those teams. Even if you still say Qatar bad, but you watch the Qatar World Cup, there's money going into the Qatar government, and we think that this is also something that is really bad, because these countries gain money. This is why Russia is hosting the Olympics, because it's insane amounts of money that go to Russia, and then Russia can have like more capacity to do horrible things. Why does this principle even matter? These two principles even matter in this debate? They themselves say that all practical impacts are extremely marginal in this debate. On players, they say that these players are abused only to a very little extent, and that's why the money incentive is not going to be enough for them to not leave, and on their side of the house they leave when because these bonuses don't exist, right? They themselves say this. They also say that the money leagues get, there's also not likely to be a lot of money because because people will still watch those leagues either way. You can't get like more probably fans on your side of the house. So therefore, you have like very marginal practical impacts in this debate, but you have these big principal impacts that really matter and that outweigh those very marginal practical impacts. Let's talk about those practical impacts. Before that, a POI.
Okay. In the Saudi Arabian League, Ronaldo, Mahrez have already played in the same league on the same team for 5 years. How is that not?
That's not true. That's not true. The Saudi League was created 3 years ago. This is simply false, right? But even then, like sports washing still happens. What you have is much higher scale. You have scale because there's more people going to Saudi Arabia instead of staying on their teams for like a year or two longer. At the very worst case scenario for our side of the house, where people generally just prioritize money, you have at least more players going to Saudi Arabia, right? On the fan stand, their argument about like leagues getting more money is just a lie, right? Because how do leagues get money? It's not through selling merch, because it's teams who get money through selling merch. It's through streaming. But they themselves say that, oh, what we're gonna do is make streaming more engaging. What does that even mean? You'll have like a subway service on the half of the screen so people watch the basketball game. This is something that is like, very unclear to us of how leagues get more money from this. Maybe they get more attention from like trades happening, but trades happen either way. Please note this. How the Luka Doncic example, which they themselves bring, exists on both sides of the house. Why? Because it was not Luka Doncic who requested that trade. It was the team that traded Luka Doncic, right? So therefore, it was not the player's choice. This debate is about the player's choice. We frame this to you, right? We tell you that this is about the player's choice of whether they want to stay in the team or if they want to move out, where they might get more money. If a team trades a player, that happens either way, or a team sells a player, that happens either way. What is on our side of the house, on the fans and on like the leagues, that is completely exclusive? What we have is increased competitiveness through two main mechanisms. Firstly, rich teams and the big market teams surely will buy most of the players, but now will have less capacity to buy some of the middle-sized teams players, right? Those players are usually the ones who are the best players on those middle-sized teams and who probably are crucial to the system the teams play. Therefore, because they are crucial to the system, when you remove that player, the system crumbles. Therefore, if you have that player stay for longer, you have a system that works around that player, and you have the team increasingly becoming more better. This is a mechanism we brought to you in our first speech, unrebutted completely, right? Therefore, we have these middle-sized teams increasingly getting more competitive and making the league more interesting. Proud to host.
Volume check, is this fine? Yup. The burden of the proposition team is extremely high because they needed to prove to you why this way of using the money was extremely beneficial in comparison to all other alternatives that exist. They say this is outside of our fiat, and the extent of your logic is to say, oh, we break the antitrust law. Okay, then we give less expensive contract to weak teams. So the point is, I think it wasn't just about us breaking up teams. It had more nuance. It was about giving subsidies to smaller teams. It was about the advertisement and allocation of funding towards these smaller tournaments that exist regionally. It was about the strategic choices that we are able to make under our side of the house. I think that is still willing to fiat. I think the dismissive response was just enough. It's not enough for a proposition to apply to respond. I want to talk about 4 themes in speech. First, on the principle, I'm going to explain why this just doesn't matter to debate. Secondly, on the leagues. Thirdly, on the audience. And lastly, on smaller teams. First things first, let's talk about the principle of this debate. I want to first flag the strategic case shift that we saw in the proposition of speech. Because note, the bottom line that they both Pop first and Pop second speaker talked about is the justification, right? So even if we just concede to the entirety of their principle, at best they justify, it's not a positive principle as to why obligation exists. But even if this was a positive principle, I would argue 2 things. Firstly, this is a non-principle. The reason for that is very intuitive. Players meaningfully made a choice to opt into this industry to begin with. And this is a meaningful choice because currently there's abundance of the counter narratives and pushback against your choice to go into this industry where everybody tells you that this is not a good choice for you to make, that you won't succeed. So individuals must have made an active thought process and went into this industry to begin with, all of which proves to you the active opt-in that they have made. But the second thing I want to point out is that if this was an obligation that exists, although we disagree, then presumably they themselves do not meet this obligation to begin with. Because as Kantaro explains, it's the smallest players that makes the most amount of sacrifice that they themselves forfeit. They say they care about everybody. But if you look at the motion literally explicitly suggests that this is about the accomplished players, which is presumably the top 10% of the players and 90% of the ones that they need to forfeit under their side of the house. Second clash then. Let's talk about leagues. I want to first flag from the beginning that there are 2 responses and mechanisms that we gave from our first speaker that just largely went unresponded to. The first mechanism was on the merchandise sale. We gave you already 2 main mechanisms in our second speaker as to why merges are more important than increased competition. But the second thing I want to point out is in terms of trade itself being interesting. This looks like mid-tables clubs getting new players for the new season creates excitement. This looks like Messi coming to Miami FC. They say 2 things. One, they say that this is not exclusive, but this is a trade-off that proposition needs to take. This is their reason as to why more people will stay, and consistency is more important, but this is our reason as to why the trading is important. But the second thing I want to point out is if teams trading players still happens, it harms their principle of consistency. The principle are just entirely reliant on consistency is important. But I want to make a clarification here. Even in tradings that happen, that when players don't have a choice or when players don't have an intention over it, I don't think that the team want a disgruntled player. So I think players with intention still matters in this debate, and that is when the largest delta lies in. The second thing I want to do is just deal with the context that came from their world, because they say the current phenomenon of the loss of interest in sports directly comes with its current structure. I don't think this is true. There's literally no correlation, and this is an assertion, right? This presumably comes from things like increasing optional alternatives other entertainment, such as games. This looks like the rise of the internet means that a lot of people are becoming indoors. I don't think this is a relevant thing that they can say for their side of the house. Now then, let's deal with their mechanism and how you get increased competitiveness, which was the strongest claim that came from their world. Firstly, flip this argument. The reason why we are able to flip it against their world is because of our third mechanism that just they can see. Because we told you that the concentration of skills between good leagues and small leagues happen in our world, where they even concede through their example of Saudi Arabia leagues. The reason why this creates competitiveness is because in smaller teams, in smaller leagues, it is the smaller teams with less strength that remains, which means that I think in our world, I think keep teams with relatively the same amount of power remains, creating competitiveness. The comparative that they willingly have to defend in their world is top teams having the top players within the small leagues, which is why I think competitiveness is flipped against their side of the house. Secondly, this is at best symmetric or if not worse in their world, because before players move, preemptively, it is the big teams that are able to recruit the young talents symmetrically on their side of the house. And insofar as moving does not happen in their world, I think this inequality that they suggested is likely to be cemented on their side of the house. This is unlikely to move, which is why I think the things that they say is important largely is symmetric if not worse on their side of the house. I want to note, this claim in leagues is the most by virtue of having more funding into leagues, by virtue of having more viewerships into leagues, and having more sales into leagues. The second thing I want to point out is that this is logically prior to all of your mechanism as to why the smaller teams are benefited at far side of the house. The reason for that is when you get increased attention, that is at the point at which these smaller leagues that nobody cared about previously are now cared about. Thirdly, let's talk about the audience then. I think the strongest thing that came from their world was the emotional connection. I have a few responses. One, this is categorically untrue. The reason for that is that it's just unintuitive that people just suddenly just draw attention to one specific player. I think a more logical thing to presume is that most people draw attention to the entirety of the playing team because it's not the players, but it is the teams that represent the specific location to begin with. But even if you don't take that, I think if you truly love the players that much, then moving to another team doesn't really remove that affection to begin with. So for example, in Japan, a lot of the soccer players, for example, like Lithuania, is moving to Europe. That doesn't mean that people don't like Lithuania. In fact, people love playing, so people love seeing them playing on the international stage. It's unclear what the delta really is. But third of all, in terms of weighing, this is a negligible impact in the debate as opposed to the impacts, the tangible impacts that we bring to you, to the players, to the sports league, and to the sports and audience in general. Lastly, let's chat about the small lines in general before now making a point.
Leagues make their money from streaming services. How is there more streaming services or more viewers on your side of the house? This has never been explained.
Okay, so the first thing I want to point out is that they never proved the effectiveness of that streaming services that presumably exist metrically, but that's not working precisely because I think the smaller teams are small for a reason. The reason why merchandise is effective is because you get different players from different teams. That's when I want to talk about the consistency of players. Even if smaller teams are just consistent on their role, there are two reasons why this response doesn't work. Firstly, because you need to evaluate this in a more relative sense. If every team is consistent, then every team becomes weaker, even if their mechanism is strong, which is the reason why this just doesn't disproportionately affect the smaller teams. But the second thing I want to point out is that our merchandise mechanism works against their world. Because if it is true that you get different players moving from different areas, this isn't just about the best players, right? The different players coming in is just objectively better insofar as you get viewership from the fans of that player who moved into your team, which is why this mechanism is independently winning even within the smaller team's mechanism. Finally, I want to emphasize the impacting of our second argument, because our argument was about players not being able to move to other teams because they have optimism bias, because they have bias that they can succeed within it. This is important insofar as this just generally suffocates the career development, and that this just breathes into your mechanism on how players are treated worse within their teams. For all of those reasons, we win at every match.
At the top, just 30 seconds on players, because I don't think this is engaged enough, and I think this is a fairly important argument in this debate. The impact to players was fairly obvious from first if you listen to the actual illustrated material that Opp never bothered to listen to. This is about coaches that you don't particularly do work well with, who hamper your career progression and therefore cut your career shorter. This is about being stuck in teams that don't care about you, that don't give you an opportunity to play and hamper your ability to be successful. This is about relationships within teams that make you necessarily sadder or angry or be in a worse environment, and this is impactful. Crucially, this argument is important in this debate on two levels. One, because obviously these are more vulnerable actors than large institutions like leagues or Saudi Arabia or Qatar. These people face direct implicated harm. They're very vulnerable individuals. But also secondly, because the extent of harm that they can face is fairly large in this debate, and we would argue that this clash therefore is fairly important. Before I move on to the important question of the league, I just want to quickly talk about sports washing and the principle. On sports washing, we dealt with both of the two impacts of sports washing. We told you that international backlash is just not an important argument in this debate, considering it's not very impactful in being able to do anything to Qatar or Saudi Arabia. Their practices largely haven't changed. And in terms of funding them more, obviously, Saudi Arabia's main profit is definitely not the soccer league. And in the absence of the soccer league, they'll just do a million other things that they can do, like invest more in manufacturing, for example. This is not unique. On the principle, we proved not only are they not principally consistent, they didn't prove the principle in the first place, and that we fulfill the principle to an adequate degree in our role by playing players adequately. Obviously, these two are not the contentious material in this debate. Most important question. Let's talk about the league. We argued from second speaker that the most important thing under the caution of the league is money. This is because money can impact everything at worst. The proper way to deal with this is to argue you can't give money to small teams because this is against antitrust laws. Oftentimes, I don't think that this is an adequate response because then all we have to do is find alternatives, like giving preferential contracts to smaller teams that allows us to therefore tax these small teams less and take smaller interest, for example. Obviously, we can win on money. How then do we prove this money? We prove merchandise sales is the biggest thing in this debate. The proper response is to argue that merchandise sales goes to the team, not the league. Crucially, this is flawed on two levels. One, many leagues just take cuts out of merchandise sales that teams do anyway, so it directly implicates the league. But also secondly, increased money that teams have then also means that leagues can, for example, charge higher for their membership, for example, and a bunch of other trickle-down ways that the league can be impacted. The second thing I want to talk about under this question is on competitiveness. The proper argument is to say that small teams are screwed. Not only did we flip this from deputy to no response from their bench, by the way, we talked about the primary way small teams can gain a competitive advantage and gain more money is to sell their goods, to develop players and sell them, which is only available in a system without loyalty. But then we proved a contending argument about how we balance the level of the leagues. This is the third mechanism in our argument. Crucially, we would argue that this line of mechanism is more important than the small teams argument because it's about the competitiveness of the entire league as a whole, which is much more impactful and much more important. Third and final thing under this question, on fan engagement. Clearly, the impact that they wanted to push under fan engagement is not fans having fun. Fun is replicable. The impact then must be money. Crucially, this then isn't a big impact in this debate because shallow fans who are only attached to one player is largely symmetric in the debate. They're shallow, they don't spend a lot of money. What matters more is core supporters. We proved this from deputy. In comparison to this then, our constructive material under fan engagement was that the trade is interesting. Why is this more important than the one player is interesting clash? One, because this trade is specifically most entertaining to people who have the strongest attachment to one player, because now you're curious about where that one player goes. But also secondly, because there's just more people in number. The majority of fans are not interested in one player, but an entire team or multiple players, which means the trade being interesting is more impactful to a majority of players, even on fan engagement as well. For these reasons, oppose.
Tries to win on this debate on a very small margin. Let me illustrate. First of all, they talk about small teams that make money through selling players. That is their decision. From the first speech, we tell you it's about the players' decision that they make that is the comparative on both sides of the house, right? The small teams will sell players on both sides of the house because it is not the player's fault. Thus, bonuses and loyalties will not influence, in any case, this actor's choice, right? But secondly, we tell you that when you talk about this huge impact of league, there is actually no impact on their side. Why? Because the only mechanism they give that to you is about merchandise, which we tell you goes to the team. Then they say, oh, they can claim a small cut. What is that cut under the status quo? It's like 5%. It means nothing. There is no merit to prove for leagues under their side of the house, and they fail to do that on their side of the house. But lastly, they talk about players and how this is important, but the way that they phrase this is that players suffer in the ways that they can't even notice. Then why do we care Why? Because we tell them on their best case scenario, or we disregard any responses that we give, all that they have is that trade is entertaining. And note, I have to correct them, it is not trade, it is the moving of players that is entertaining, because trade is symmetric. Initially, they tried to create an impact as the greatest impact in this debate that is symmetrical on most of the house, but then they changed it to moving players. So why doesn't this work? First of all, we think even if moving is entertaining, it comes at a cost, right? We think we do significant legwork to show that cost. First of all, is the fact that you still feel sad when you have a player that you didn't follow for so many years go to another team. It is still additional complication to go track that player throughout different teams. It is not the same experience. But secondly, there's a huge chance that they concede to that you are morally not good at the challenge, that you want to follow your player into Saudi Arabia, where it morally doesn't align with the fact what you think that Saudi Arabia is doing, right? The sports washing impacts not the international scale, it's the viewer who has to make compromises now because we don't value loyalty and we don't push players and encourage them to stay within teams that they have been loyalty for the past few years. But then on the worst case scenario on our side of the house, it is a sport is not competitive, but fans still watch sport, right? First of all, we tell you that there are several factors why fans watch sports. Surely they will still watch baseball if they like baseball, but it's so much more fun to watch baseball if you have your favorite team with that consistency that you have followed through many years. It is so much more interesting if you can see a round where the baseball player wins that round and it is your favorite baseball player. So on a scale, we prove to you that the impacts that we reach for in this debate are much more significant to the fans, even on our worst case scenario, right? But then let's address the players clash here that they claim we never address, right? What do they tell you? They tell you that abuse happens and players don't really notice or don't care enough to leave and will therefore stay for the bonuses. First of all, we think there are rational factors. If it is significant enough of an abuse, we tell you in our first speech, then they will leave, right? Because the bonus can surely be offered by a richer team that you can just go for it and stay there, right? But secondly, if it is really not that big of a harm, then we don't understand why we care about it, right? Because I genuinely don't understand why I have to care that LeBron James was genuinely pissed off because the manager benched him, right? It is like a one-term interaction that they never prove the significance of. But let's weigh this in likelihood. Look, we tell you that the more you move through different teams, the more likely you are to stumble across an abusive coach, right? The more you're likely to stumble across a team that will harm you more, right? When you are in one team that you are interested in staying in, that means that you are less likely to have